We're here in the Ancient Egypt Rediscovered Gallery to look at some objects that can offer us insights into the lives of women in Greco-Roman Egypt. So when we're talking about ancient Egypt, most people will be thinking of the Pharaonic period, around 3100 BC onward for several thousand years, and the Greco-Roman period begins in precisely 332 BC when Alexander the Great conquers Egypt, and Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire in 30 BC with the defeat of Cleopatra VII, and the Roman rule in Egypt continues beyond then, and one of the ways that we sort of consider the end of that period is around 395 AD when the last hieroglyphic inscription was written. So throughout Egyptian history there is quite a lot of change and influences coming in, but many of the most sort of core traditional beliefs actually in terms of religious beliefs and funerary beliefs actually continue through that period, even though the sort of fashions and ways that those are expressed change over time. In Egypt, women actually had a lot more rights than some women in other ancient cultures. Particularly, for example, ancient Greece. They were able to buy and sell property, they could inherit property, lease land, or own businesses, and even though most of their lives of the majority of women revolved around marriage and family and the home, actually they had the right to divorce, and they were able to take their dowries with them if divorce happened. They were able to take the property that they had brought to the marriage. So even though they weren't of equal standing in ancient Egyptian society, they were actually participating quite a lot, and there's a lot that we can tell about their lives from texts in particular that survive on ancient Egyptian papyri. But objects are also able to offer us a lot of insights as well, from objects that they made and used, telling us about their daily lives, but also from the images that show them and that give us an idea of how they wanted to represent themselves to society and how they wanted to project their identities into the afterlife, how they wanted to be seen for eternity. So in Greco-Roman era Egypt, there were lots of new influences coming in with influxes of people from outside of Egypt. But one of the things that particularly stayed the same was funerary practices. They existed with very little change for millennia. And even the newcomers to Egypt, I think, trusted in that. The fact that there was a strong belief in this really powerful ancient magic and practices that had existed for so long. So even people from outside Egypt who came to Egypt would be mummified. That was one of the main differences in funerary practices in Egypt. There was a belief that the body needed to be preserved in order for the person to exist into the afterlife. And that's where we have some incredible images of women from that period. And we're in front of a beautiful example. And it's really interesting to compare between some of these portraits as well, because they show the choices and the agency that women had in terms of how they wanted to be represented and the kind of approach that they wanted to take in order to help ensure that they would exist forever. So this incredibly vivid portrait shows a young woman in her prime of life, and it's really naturalistic in terms of its representation, which is achieved through a style of painting that we call encaustic, achieved through the mixing of pigments with hot wax so that it was possible to actually blend the colors and create a much more naturalistic style. And even though this kind of portrait might seem a lot more familiar to us as opposed to ancient Egyptian styles of representation, it's actually still an incredibly Egyptian image because of how it was actually used. This young woman wanted to be able to live forever, and what better way to try to achieve that than showing her as so vividly alive. And while many examples of this style of portrait are displayed flat against the wall, framed, and so they come across as looking a bit like portraits that we might be familiar with from European culture, we need to remember that this would have actually originally been placed on top of the mummified woman's face as part of her wrappings, and probably combined with a shroud that actually was decorated with ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses in order to protect her. So even though it might initially appear much more Roman than Egyptian, it really is both. And it's incredible too that we're able to very precisely date this example because of the really intricate and accurately depicted style of hairstyle, the fashions that changed over time. You can pin that down to around about 110 to 130 AD, and it's such a vivid and compelling portrait. But it's really interesting to note that if you compare examples from the same site, so this example is from a site in Egypt called Hawara, you see that different people were making different choices in terms of how they wanted to be represented. And if we go around to the other side of the case, we'll see another example of a young woman depicted in a very different looking style, but from the same time and place as this example. So this mummy mask here depicts a young girl, and it does have some aspects of portraiture to it in terms of having more realistic depiction of the detail on her hair, but it's also very, very traditional in the sense that she's shown with gilded skin in order to help her transition to living for eternity, in accordance with the ancient Egyptian belief that the skin of the gods was made of gold. And was all enduring. And she's depicted surrounded by protective images of ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses, with her spirit in the form of a human-headed bird standing before them. So there's a lot of really traditional elements here, right down to the style of wrapping that goes back to earlier bead net shrouds, like the one just above here. So it's quite different to the other portrait that we've seen here, but another aspect that's quite unusual about this example is that she, even though she died when she was only around 5 years old, she's depicted as an adult. Society at the time really emphasized the role that women held as wives and mothers, and so in order for her to have a fulfilling life, even though she died so incredibly young, she's shown as an adult, and she was buried with this really unusual selection of objects here, various cosmetic and perfume bottles made out of glass, and also a set of mirrors as well, really emphasizing the importance of beauty in terms of fertility. And the most unusual object from the set, though, is this incredible wooden label. It might not look as much, but it's a completely unique example of a type of object that was usually attached to the mummified person in order to express their identity, and it usually records their name, often written in both Egyptian Demotic script and also Greek, except for this example is completely pictorial. And so her name isn't recorded, but her identity is expressed through a depiction of a woman who is probably the girl's mother and really links her identity to hers. And it's an extraordinary image, a rare example of a depiction of a woman shown in childbirth. And it gives us some insights into what that experience was like in ancient times. She's shown squatting on a birthing stool as a way to protect the baby as it was born. And the woman is shown completely naked, except for some elaborate jewellery. Obviously you want to look your best if you're being depicted on an object that's going to last for eternity, hopefully. And she's also shown wearing a pair of socks, because even in ancient Egypt, you didn't want your feet to get cold. And we actually have an example of a sock, just like the ones that she would have been wearing in this image. You'll notice that it's also got a little fork in the toe so that you could wear socks and sandals. It's amazing to have objects like these on display and in the museum collection, because for quite a long time, a lot of objects like these weren't really valued, collected, studied, because they were seen as objects linked to female craft production, and they weren't really valued in the same way. And actually, women curators, textile archaeologists, things like they're the ones that have actually refocused attention on how much we're missing out on aspects of history if we ignore objects like these. It's really just an incredibly charming object, and really offers so many insights into who this girl was and what life was like for women in Greco-Roman Egypt.